The forgotten language of the soul God is not an idea. God is an experience, a presence felt in the deepest chambers of the soul. Carl Jung, we live in a world fluent in logic, but illiterate in meaning. We speak in statistics and scroll through screens, but we have forgotten how to listen to the soul's ancient voice, a voice that does not speak in words, but in symbols, in dreams, in silence. Carl Jung did not see God as an external being perched in the heavens. He saw God as a psychic reality, a living force that dwells within the human psyche, emerging not through dogma, but through experience. To Jung, divinity was not confined to scripture or ritual. It was felt in the strange coincidences that shaped your path. It was glimpsed in the archetypes that danced through your dreams. It was known in the deep stillness behind your thoughts. God was the pattern, the pull, the numinous presence that rises from the unconscious and breaks through the noise of daily life. This is the forgotten language of the soul, a language that doesn't use grammar, but imagery. It is myth and metaphor. It is a serpent in a dream, a crow crossing your path, a child crying in the dark corner of your mind. In modern life, we are taught to dismiss these things. We call them random, we label them just dreams or coincidence. But Jung knew these are messages, symbols of a deeper truth. He called this inner language the symbolic life, a life not just measured in time and money, but in meaning, connection, and spiritual resonance. To live symbolically is to let your life be a canvas for the divine. To treat your depression not as an illness, but as a messenger. To see a recurring dream not as nonsense, but as a sacred telegram from the unconscious. God, Jung said, speaks in symbols, and those symbols come alive in the deepest chambers of your being. They don't just inform you, they transform you. So if you've ever felt like life was hollow, as if something essential is missing, perhaps it's not more information you need, perhaps what you are missing is this forgotten language. The soul longs to speak. It longs to be seen, but it cannot do so through data or analysis. It needs silence. It needs solitude. It needs your heart more than your head. When you begin to pay attention to dreams, to synchronicities, to strange stirrings, you will notice something astonishing. The divine has never stopped speaking. We have only forgotten how to listen. Archetype of the divine, the God image is embedded in the collective unconscious of humanity. Carl Jung, long before temples were built, before scriptures were penned in sacred ink, there was already something stirring in the soul of humanity, a longing, a whisper, a presence too vast to name. Carl Jung called it the archetype of the divine, a living symbol rooted not in culture or creed, but in the deepest layers of the human psyche. This God image is not invented. It is discovered again and again by mystics, seekers, poets, and prophets across time and geography. It appears as Christ in the West, as Shiva in the East, as Allah, as the Great Spirit, as the Tao. Each name, each myth, each sacred story is a different garment worn by the same eternal presence. To Jung, the archetype of God is not just a belief, it is a psychic reality, an inner structure within the collective unconscious that gives shape to humanity's spiritual yearning. We are not taught to believe in God. We are born with a blueprint for the divine. It is why a child looks at the stars and feels awe, why ancient civilizations, with no contact between them, built temples and told stories of higher powers, why a dream of light, a vision of fire, can awaken something holy within. The divine archetype emerges when the soul is ready in a moment of crisis, a vision, a loss that breaks the ego and opens the heart. You do not have to believe in any one religion to feel its presence. Because the archetype is not confined to dogma, it uses dogma like a metaphor. The cross, the crescent, the lotus, they are symbols for something deeper than the symbols themselves. They are the psyche's way of pointing to the mystery. But here is the danger. When the symbol becomes mistaken for the truth, when the image becomes an idol, we lose the living energy behind it. Jung warned against the literalization of symbols. He knew that when religion becomes rigid, the archetype withdraws and what remains is an empty shell, a system without soul. The true encounter with the divine is always transformative. It is never comfortable, never shallow. It rearranges you, it brings the unconscious to light, and in doing so it asks something from you, to become whole. This is why the God archetype matters, because it leads you not outward, but inward. Not into blind faith, but into sacred integration. So whether you pray in a church, or weep before a sunset, or are shaken by a dream that leaves you breathless, know this. The divine is already within you, waiting for your soul to remember what it has always known. Beyond belief, the inner knowing, I do not believe in God. I know. Carl Jung at first glance, it sounds audacious, borderline heresy. I do not believe in God. I know. As if Jung were placing himself above centuries of faith and tradition. But he wasn't speaking from pride, he was speaking from the sacred fire of direct experience. Jung didn't believe in the divine the way one might believe in distant stars. He knew it not through scripture or sermons, but through the trembling, wordless certainty that arises when the soul brushes against mystery. This knowing is not theoretical. It's not taught in books or memorized in doctrine. It comes when something ancient stirs within you in a dream, in a moment of unbearable stillness, or in the aching beauty of a sunset that leaves you breathless. For Jung, God was not a hypothesis to be argued. God was an experience raw, numinous, alive, that emerged from the depths of the unconscious, in the vision, in the archetype, in the synchronicity that defied logic yet felt inevitable. This knowing is not comfortable. It doesn't stroke the ego. It often unsettles, even wounds, because it cracks the shell of certainty and floods you with something greater than the mind can grasp. That is the difference between belief and knowing. Belief clings. Knowing opens. Belief demands agreement. Knowing simply is. Belief lives in the intellect. Knowing flows from the soul. This is the mystic's path, not a rejection of religion, but a deepening beyond it. Ritual can be sacred, scripture can be luminous, but they are only maps, not the terrain itself, and Jung walked that inner terrain. Through his own descent into the unconscious, through the terrifying visions that came in his red book, through the symbolic death and rebirth he lived within, he encountered the divine not as a theory, but as a presence that spoke not in words, but in images, in instincts, in the holy silence that remains after the ego shatters. He understood what the mystics knew all along, that God is not somewhere else. Not a king in the clouds, but a fire in the center of the soul. To know God, then, is not to agree with an idea, but to surrender to an encounter. It requires courage, not to believe but to know, to dissolve the rigid lines of dogma and meet the mystery within. So when Jung said, I do not believe in God, I know, he wasn't dismissing faith. He was inviting you to go deeper, to step beyond inherited belief, and dare to feel the infinite with your own trembling hands. Light and shadow in the divine, the God image must embrace both light and darkness to be whole. Carl Jung, we have been taught to see God in the light, in goodness, mercy, and love. But what of wrath? What of silence, chaos, suffering? What of the shadow that moves through the sacred? Carl Jung, in his radical and soul-shaking work Answer to Job, dares to say what most would not. The God image is split. In the story of Job, we find a faithful man destroyed, his family taken, his body afflicted, his world shattered, and yet God allows it. No reason, no comfort, just silence. Jung did not reject God because of this. He looked deeper. He saw that the divine, if it is to be real, if it is to be whole, must contain both the Creator and the Destroyer. To deny the darkness within God is to create a hollow idol. To deny the darkness within yourself is to remain forever divided. We want God to be only good. We want ourselves to be only good. But the psyche is not so simple. The soul does not grow in the light alone. It is refined in the fire, in the confusion, in the long nights when heaven says nothing. Jung called this the process of individuation, not becoming perfect, but becoming whole, and wholeness requires confrontation with the shadow. The shadow is not just what we hate in others, It is what we deny in ourselves. It is our rage, our lust, our envy, our fear, but also our power, our passion, our truth. What we repress in ourselves, we end up projecting onto God, onto others, onto enemies we create to avoid facing our own darkness. But if God is to be truly divine, he must also contain the potential for wrath, for destruction, for shadow. Not because he is evil, but because he is complete. This is why Jung saw Christ and Satan not as equal forces in battle, but as symbols of a deeper unity yet to be realized. A split God is an immature God. A split self is an unintegrated soul. In answer to Job, Jung says that humanity has a moral responsibility to confront the divine shadow to awaken conscience within God, just as we awaken it within ourselves. It is a bold thought, a dangerous one, but also a healing one, because once we see that even the divine must evolve, we stop pretending that we must be flawless. We stop rejecting the parts of ourselves that feel unholy. We begin to see the light needs the shadow to be whole, and God, like the human soul, is still unfolding, still wrestling with himself, still seeking integration. Just like you, God in the human psyche, the experience of God begins in the depths of the self. Carl Jung, we search for God in the heavens, in temples, scriptures, and stars, but Jung tells us, look inward. The divine is not found only in doctrine or distance, but in the most intimate and hidden parts of your soul, not as a belief, but as an experience, a living presence within. In Jungian psychology, the self is more than your conscious identity. It is the totality of your being, the union of opposites, the harmony of shadow and light, the still center around which your psyche orbits. And this self, Jung says, mirrors the image of God. When we glimpse the self through dreams, symbols, synchronicity, or inner crisis, we are not just meeting a part of ourselves. We are touching the divine within. This is why the journey toward psychological wholeness is not just mental health. It is spiritual work. It is a sacred pilgrimage back to the God image buried beneath ego, fear, and persona. Many mistake God as something out there, a remote ruler, a cosmic judge, separate and superior. But Jung's insight was radical. God is not an external entity. God is the archetype of wholeness itself woven into the fabric of the psyche. The holy is not only above, it is within, waiting to be remembered. This is why Jung saw the process of individuation not merely as psychological integration, but as a form of divine union, just as mystics speak of uniting with God, of drawing the fragmented parts of the self into one luminous center. This sacred center is not perfect in the moral sense. It holds both beauty and terror, shadow and grace. It transcends the false split between good and evil. To truly meet the self is to bow before something greater than the ego. It humbles you, it cracks you open, and yet it restores you, because when you meet the self, you remember that you were never alone, the voice in your dreams, the symbols that haunt your heart. The inner guidance you could never quite explain, that was God speaking through the language of your soul. It is not I who created myself, rather I happen to myself. In those moments when the ego dissolves through grief, awe, beauty, or despair, we fall into something eternal. We glimpse the vastness that we truly are, and in that stillness we no longer need to believe in God. We know because we feel the divine echoing in the chambers of our own soul. The quest for God, then, is not a path outward. It is a return inward to the sacred fire that has always been burning at the center of who you are. Synchronicity, the voice of the divine, synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. Carl Jung, have you ever had a moment so precise, so perfectly timed, that it felt like the universe was whispering to you, not logic, not coincidence, but something more, a quiet shiver down the spine, a symbol appearing just when you needed it, a stranger saying the exact words your soul was aching to hear? This is synchronicity, Jung's name for the phenomenon where inner experience and outer events align in a way that cannot be explained by cause and effect, but carry deep meaning. In a world obsessed with measurement and proof, synchronicity reminds us that life is not a machine, it is a living mystery. Jung first observed this in therapy. A patient would describe a dream involving a scarab, and in that very moment, a real scarab beetle would tap against the window. Not random, meaningful, the event was charged with emotion, a numinous encounter where psyche and matter intertwined. It was as if the unconscious had reached out through symbol and circumstance to say, I am here. I am watching, I am part of this. For Jung, synchronicity was the language of the self, the deeper, eternal center within us that mirrors the divine. When we align with our true path, synchronicities increase not to flatter the ego, but to guide the soul. They are signs, winks from the universe, not proof of fate, but whispers of alignment. They tell us, you are not walking this road alone. There is a deeper pattern beneath the chaos. There is a sacred geometry beneath your doubts. But to hear this voice, to recognize the divine fingerprint, we must slow down. We must stop reducing life to tasks and timelines. Synchronicity asks for presence. It asks that we feel our dreams, honor our intuition, and look at life not just with the eyes of reason, but with the soul's deep gaze. It requires faith not in dogma, but in symbol, in meaning itself. When the outer world mirrors your inner transformation, you are standing at a threshold. In that instant, the ego bows, time softens, and you feel, if only for a breath, that life is a conversation, not an accident. Synchronicity is not magic, it is not a trick. It is the sacred intersection where your story meets the eternal, and in those moments you are reminded, your soul is known, your journey is guided, and the divine, however you name it, speaks in patterns, not just words. Religious symbols are psychic truths, myth is not fiction. It is the soul's truth dressed in symbol. Carl Jung, we often divide the world into two, fact and fiction, history and fantasy, science and myth. But Carl Jung stood in the in-between. He saw that religious stories, ancient myths, and sacred symbols were not lies we outgrow, but truths we have forgotten how to read. To Jung, religion was never merely doctrine. It was the symbolic expression of deep psychic realities, mysteries so profound they could not be spoken in literal words, only in metaphor, only in symbol, only in the language of the soul. A crucifixion is not just a historical claim. It is the story of every human soul that has been torn between ego and surrender, between control and transformation. It is your story, your inner death, your rebirth and resurrection, that moment you rise from suffering, when you no longer live from fear, but from love that is not dogma. That is psychic truth. Religious symbols, Christ on the cross, Shiva dancing in destruction, Buddha under the tree are all mirrors of the same inner journey, the path of descent, confrontation, illumination. The soul's slow transformation through shadow and light. To dismiss these symbols as just stories is to miss their power. They are not entertainment. They are sacred maps, encoded messages from the collective unconscious, what Jung called the archetypal layer of the psyche. This is where humanity stores its shared memory, its ancient dreams, fears, patterns, and potentials, and through these symbols the self tries to speak. When you light a candle, when you bow in prayer, when you enter silence, you are not performing a superstition. You are participating in an eternal ritual that mirrors the movement of your own soul toward wholeness. Jung believed that even modern people stripped of religion, skeptical of myth, still long for meaning, still hunger for connection to something deeper, and when that hunger is not fed through soul, it manifests in addiction, anxiety, nihilism. We do not outgrow our need for symbols. We just forget how to honor them. To reclaim them is not to return to blind belief. It is to awaken to inner reverence, to see that the sacred is not trapped in dogma, but breathes in every image, every ritual, every dream that dares to touch what is holy. Religious symbols, then, are not about what is out there. They are about what is becoming within you. They speak not to the mind, but to the soul, and when you truly hear them, you remember, the sacred is not a fantasy. It is the truth of your own transformation, wrapped in story waiting to be lived. God needs consciousness. God becomes real when man becomes conscious. Carl Jung, in the quiet chambers of the soul, where the divine and the human meet, Jung offered a radical idea. God is not finished. God is still becoming, and that becoming, that painful unfolding, requires you. In answer to Job, Jung dared to say what few mystics had said aloud, that God, as portrayed in Scripture, is not yet whole. He is powerful, yes, but not yet fully conscious. The God of Job, who wounds without reason, who watches suffering with silence, is not evil but incomplete. And it is human suffering, the moral anguish of the awakened heart, that becomes the mirror in which the divine sees itself. When Job dares to question, when he holds his pain with dignity, when he refuses to flatter a God he does not understand, he becomes more conscious than the deity who tests him. And in that moment, Jung writes, God sees his shadow. This is the turning point. This is evolution not of man alone, but of the God image itself. For what is God, if not the archetype of the self, and what is the self, if not in the process of becoming? As we awaken, as we confront our own darkness, as we take responsibility for our inner world, we help God awaken too, not in some distant heaven, but in the depths of psyche. The more conscious we become, the more the divine takes form. This is not blasphemy. It is participation in the sacred. We are not passive creations. We are co-creators in the birth of meaning. When you face your shadow, you are not only healing yourself, you are offering clarity to the whole. When you hold your suffering with awareness, you are adding vision to the divine. In this view, God is not omniscient from the start. God, like us, must pass through darkness to find light, must wrestle with moral tension, must look into the mirror of human pain and see what power alone cannot see: compassion, humility, consciousness. It is a bold and terrifying truth, that we are not just made in God's image. We are part of God's becoming. Each act of awareness, each moment of truth, each soul that dares to see and not look away, is a thread woven into the evolving tapestry of the divine itself. And so Jung whispered to the mystics and the modern seekers, do not worship blindly. Awaken bravely, for it is through the human soul that God learns to love. Individuation is the sacred path. To individuate is to walk the path of the soul. It is a sacred act. Carl Jung, there comes a moment in every human life when the world outside no longer satisfies the soul within, when no amount of success, praise, or possession can silence the quiet ache, the whisper that says, "You are more than this." That whisper is the beginning of individuation, not a theory, not a philosophy, but a sacred, lived process. It is the slow and often painful work of becoming the person you were meant to be before the world told you who you should be. Jung called it the journey to the self, the deepest center of your being, where all the opposites you have exiled long to come home. It begins with descent into the unconscious, into the forgotten, into the shadow. You must face the parts of yourself that make you uncomfortable, the anger you hide, the desire you deny, the wounds you pretend do not hurt. This is not self-improvement, it is self-encounter. You do not polish the mask, you remove it, and as the old persona crumbles, you begin to glimpse something strange and radiant, the unfragmented self. Individuation is not a path of perfection, it is a path of wholeness. You do not become pure light, you become the dance of light and shadow. You hold contradictions not as problems to fix, but as mysteries to honor. In this sacred integration, you meet what Jung called the God image within, not a God outside you, but the divine pattern in your psyche calling you toward completion. To individuate is not to escape the world. It is to enter it more fully as your authentic, unshakable self, the warrior who knows their fear, the healer who knows their wounds, the lover who knows their longing. This journey is holy because it restores to you what was lost: your voice, your vision, your soul. It is a spiritual path because it demands not belief, but bravery, not obedience, but awareness, not exile of the self, but union with it. Each step toward integration is a step toward God, not in the sky, but in your own depths. And so, individuation becomes the new pilgrimage not to a sacred mountain, but to the sanctuary within. No priest, no teacher, no guru can walk it for you. It is your soul's walk home where the divine waits not to judge, but to welcome you into the fullness of who you truly are. The sacred mystery within God is not out there. God is here, within you, and waiting to be born into consciousness. Carl Jung, in the end, Jung did not leave us with answers, he left us with a mirror. Not to reflect who we pretend to be, but to reveal who we truly are beneath the layers, the mask, the persona, the fear. At the heart of his life's work was not a doctrine or a dogma, but a sacred invitation. Go within. There, in the trembling dark, you will find the light you seek. The greatest illusion of modern man is that the divine is elsewhere in temples, in dogma, in distant heavens. But Jung whispered a deeper truth. God is not far away. God is near, very near, so near that you may miss it, not in the thunder, but in the quiet ache of your longing, not in the rituals of the crowd, but in the stillness of your solitude, not in what you believe, but in what you are willing to feel. The sacred is not a reward. It is not a prize you earn through perfection. It is a mystery you awaken to the moment you turn your gaze inward and listen to your dreams, to your wounds, to your shadow, to your soul. Jung taught that the self is not just a psychological concept, it is the imprint of the divine in you. It is the flame that never goes out, even when you forget it's there. It is the unspoken presence that waits behind every question. Who am I? Why am I here? What is this pain trying to teach me? And in that sacred dialogue between the ego and the self, between the human and the divine, something extraordinary happens. You begin to remember what you've always known, but were taught to forget, that you are not separate. Not from others, not from life, not from the source, you are a spark of the mystery itself, a voice in the divine symphony, a soul in the act of remembering. Jung never claimed to define God. He simply reminded us that the search for God is not about finding answers, but about deepening the questions. And the deepest question of all is not, is there a God out there? But rather, can I bear to meet the God within me? Because if you can hold your own depths without looking away, then something sacred begins to stir, not in the heavens, but in your heart, not one day, but now. This is the final mystery. You are the vessel in which the divine becomes conscious. And your life, every joy, every wound, every transformation, is a sacred text, still being written by the hand of the self within.